Hey there, welcome back to our second video in our three-part series on epoxy resin. We are all set here for our pours from the last video. Everything's prepped, everything's sanded, everything's as dust-free as we can get. And we've got our three projects here that we're gonna work on. We're gonna start with our clear epoxy. And for this, I'm gonna try and do a couple different techniques here, but we're gonna use our kitchen scale on this one. So we are going to zero that out. We're gonna start with our resin. Typically when I pour, because your resin is so much more syrupy than the hardener is, I like to start with that typically. So you can see just how thick that is. So I'm gonna take this, and I will confess to you all that the hardest part of epoxy resin for me personally is calculating the necessary volume of what you're gonna pour. So I spend a lot of time just guessing on this, eyeballing. I am sure somewhere online there is a volume calculator. I'm gonna do this at 10 ounces just to make this pretty simple and straightforward. All right, there we go. Get that off, so we got our 10 there. Now we put our hardener in here. Hardener, as you can tell, flows way quicker. A little bit over there, so I'm gonna put just a dollop more of the epoxy in there because it is very important to get those as close as possible, okay? So we're gonna set those to the side. And talking about the volume and how tricky that can be calculating that, one way, if you can't calculate that perfectly, and because resin is expensive and you don't wanna let it go to waste, I typically like to have some kind of little container, a vessel of sorts that I can pour my extra in there. And after a while, it builds up, it makes cool stuff. Stuff that you can turn down on a lathe if that's your thing. This is actually a water bottle that does not have a bottle on it. That's been cut off. So that's just what was inside. That is the resin. Really cool stuff, right? So we're gonna start with our clear resin here, which we've got that mixed. I've got a stirring stick here. And one of the things to keep in mind, because we have two different viscosities going on here between our hardener and our epoxy, is you wanna mix it fairly, certainly thoroughly, but not too vigorously, because what we don't wanna do in our mixing is create too many bubbles in there, because especially if you don't have a torch, those bubbles, while they will come out with a torch, if you don't have a torch, you can certainly minimize that by mixing it thoroughly, albeit not vigorously. So I'm gonna do this just for a few seconds more here. And I'm just using an old yogurt container here. Really, you can use anything, especially when you're using the scale. That makes life way easier. But, all right, feel pretty good about that. Make sure it's looking pretty consistent, which we are. So now comes the fun part of pouring. Whatever container you do put it in, it's nice if it's flexible and can move a little bit. If you could theoretically put it in glass, but pouring would be a little bit more difficult because you want to be able to get that spout. Now, this is our moment of truth on all of our silicone to see if we're gonna leak out. But we're gonna start by pouring that in there, just like so. I'm gonna go nice and easy under there so all that resin can kind of work under and around our little C.O.D logo. I'm just gonna go nice and easy. Let that creep on top of there. And we're just gonna fill up as much of this as we can. So it looks like our calculations, quote unquote, of eyeballing it are gonna work out pretty well. So, you can see all that. Now we do have a little bit left over here. We're gonna let that sit just for a little bit and let all that resin kind of settle. And we're gonna come back to that one in just a few moments. Okay. All right, so nice, smooth in there. Spread this out. Seeing some slight distortion. You know, there's a chance that whatever ink was used on this, maybe it's gonna bleed through, but we'll find out. Okay, so that's our first batch. We're gonna set that to the side. We're gonna go over here to our more creative of the three projects. I've already got my hardener here, so I'm gonna go ahead and double this. Now on this one, I'm gonna use a different technique, not weighing it, I'm doing just visually. So we've got a little bit under 4 ounces there. So I'm going to, if I can get this molasses to come out, take that up to 8. And now you can really see and hear the difference in those viscosities because it will separate and the heavier one goes to the bottom. Drip out. And you can see that change start to take place there. Okay, so we got that. We're gonna go ahead before we add our pigment. This one, since I've got a little Cuba coin in there, I'm gonna do some Cuba colors, blue, white, and red. We've got 2 different types of dye here. So we've got our pigment dye, which is just a powder, really iridescent. We've got some white powder in it. And then we've got an alcohol ink here too that we're gonna use. Now on this one, we are gonna fully get creative here, and I am going to put our red down in these cracks. All right, so get that off of there, just a little bit. Tuck these in here. All these colors should bleed in kind of interesting ways. So going back to the resin, I think my primary color that I want in here is gonna be this blue. Now, with this powder pigment, a little bit goes a long way. So I'm just gonna do, I want some transparency still. So I'm gonna go about that much. You can see, not a ton. So, and by adding the pigment before I mix it, it's really a good indicator of how mixed we actually are, which you can see here, we get a lot of pigment on top, not so much in the bottom. So I'm gonna try and kind of fold that in a little bit. I think I'm actually gonna switch to a different stir, something that's a little bit bigger than that one that I used. So, yeah, it's better. So now, knowing that we've got the red on there, got the blue in here, I'm gonna go ahead and start pouring this so we can get something out of that red, hopefully. You can still see we've got transparency there, and you can start to see some of the cool, oops. Pull this out and see how this settles in here. You can see some of that cool iridescence in that blue too, which is really neat. So Probably went a little bit heavy on that red. That's okay. All right, so got all that in there. Now we're missing our white, which I have right here. I'm gonna take, toothpicks are one of my favorite things to use when we're doing these color. So you can see that big old bubble coming out there, because you can really get these cool little swirly effects. Oops, get back there. And there. And a lot of this excess on the outer side, I'll probably cut off. This mold is just a little bit big for the piece that we're working on, but that's okay. I still think we'll be able to make something pretty cool out of it. So now I'm gonna try and get that pigment again off our thing. And again, I'm just gonna let this settle a little bit. I'm gonna come back, I'm gonna add our white to it, but in the meantime, while that's settling, let's go over here now, and we're gonna do this one. Now, as you can see, I've already got pigment on my gloves, so I'm gonna go ahead and switch out to another pair of gloves, because once that pigment gets on you, it's easily transferable from one project to the next, and if you don't happen to want red on a project, it's probably best to change your gloves. Okay, once you have seamlessly put on your new gloves, we're gonna go back and we're gonna mix up some more. Now on this one, we're gonna go for like a real kind of soft pink. And that's actually not a color that we have in all of our pigment. I've got this red and I've got some white, so we're gonna try and get creative here and mix up our own color. Okay, so starting with our resin, our part A, and I should note that some epoxies are 2-to-1 and some are 1-to-1 ratios of mix. This happens to be a 1-to-1. Let's see. So we're gonna do equal parts, but some of them, it is only half part hardener. So make sure you know which variety you're working with. We're really gonna be cutting it close on that. All right, again, went over there. So yeah, just a touch more. Feel pretty good about that. Okay, so now get our scale out of the way. And again, you can see the silicone ring in here, which will capture that. I'm gonna go ahead and add just a little bit of this red. Actually, you know what? I'm not. I'm gonna start with our silver pearl here and get us a nice base, and then we're gonna add some red to tint that into a pink. So. Little popsicle sticks or craft sticks work really well for getting this stuff out. Now this is one that you can just tap it in there, because I don't want a lot of transparency on this. I don't care about seeing this plywood. I mostly want the cool color that's gonna go on it. So had some silver white there and now some pure white. Both of those, you can see some of that metallic in there already. So I'm gonna go ahead and stir this up. Again, I'll switch to our larger mixing stick there. And this is where you can really tell how resin can get really messy. And it's really helpful to have good containers. I'm always on the hunt for large disposable containers that allow us to mix in, such as this one. All right, so we can see already we've got kind of a white consistency, not nearly as intensely white as I'm hoping for So I'm gonna go ahead and add a nice big dollop there. And this powder resin, again, it really sticks to you. So you want to be very careful about what you touch if you get it on you. All right, so that's a pretty good base, I think. Now I'm just gonna tap in some of this. Really don't want a whole lot, just that little bit. Just gonna start folding this in. And already we can see we're starting to get some cool color in there. And this is pretty much just a trial and error process of getting the colors that you want. So it's got a little bit of pinkish to it, but not quite as much as I'm hoping for. So I'm gonna add a little bit more of that. I think we're probably good there. Really cool color, really cool kind of effects going on in that as well. So here, we're just gonna go for it. And nice and even all around here. Now, one thing that's cool about resin, you can do a base layer, and if you wanna add to it, you can certainly do that down the line. Once that completely cures, it's just important to make sure that you really scuff up that cured surface before adding another layer to it. Because if it's too slick, it's not really gonna want to bond to it. In the same way that when this stuff cures, it's so slick, it's not really porous. The same way that you would be able to kind of chip it off a metal surface or something like that. Now, when you're going over a big flat surface like this, even though this will move and it's slow, a lot of times you do need to kind of help it along the way. We're gonna let that settle a little bit. And now, while that's settling, let's go back to our original one over here. Get all our extras out of here. And you can see we're pretty clear here, but we do have some bubbles going in. What those bubbles are from is the heat that takes place when those two chemicals mix. All that heat pulls all the air out of the wood or whatever that you're pouring it on, and it creates these tiny little air bubbles. There's a lot of ways to address that. You know, there's a lot of folks that have specialized equipment like pressure pots or vacuum chambers that pull out all the bubbles or compress them really small. But we're not doing that. We're gonna do the pyro version, which right in front of me, is our blowtorch. Now, if you watch right here, see those bubbles? Watch what happens when I take this torch and they immediately come out. And what we're left with is something that's crystal clear. Now, a cool little mistake that we found over here, so we'll let that settle a little bit. There is a bit of babysitting that has to take place when you're doing this resin stuff, because those bubbles do kind of pop up over time. Now, an obvious thing that I feel pretty foolish for not thinking about in breaking this up is wood floats, even over viscous stuff. Now, I can kind of mess with this and keep pushing this down in here, which is precisely what I'm gonna do. And I think we're still gonna end up, because we're gonna sand this when it's done, I think it's still gonna be pretty cool. But I'm gonna have to do a little bit of babysitting on that, sticking that in there. But you can really see some of the cool pigment reacting in there. You see that metal flake. You see that iridescence popping through. All this stuff can be pretty cool. So now I wanted to add some white to this. So I could add my powder here, and there's some cool techniques of just kind of sprinkling this stuff in here on top. So instead of, we're already mixed, so I'm not too concerned about that, but now I'm just gonna let it snow a little bit on here. And I'm gonna let those kind of settle down in there for a moment. We're gonna come back over to this one now, which has had a little bit of time to set in. And I'm gonna get all these bubbles out. You see, I did have a little bit of spillage there, but that's all right, we can deal with it. Really cool surface there. And for a countertop, once this is all done, I don't know if you can see all the, again, kind of pearlescence in there, but that will look so cool when it's all done. It'll be like, you know, kind of look like marble in certain ways, but it isn't. It's resin. It's cool stuff. So over here already, we can already see we've got some new bubbles that have come up here. So I'm gonna hit these. And this is essentially what we're gonna do while this sets up. Now, our setup time is gonna vary wildly depending on what you're doing. If you're doing a quick set stuff, that typically can cure in, it starts to harden in about an hour or so, and it can be fully cured in 24 hours. Some of the slow set stuff that you'd use for bigger pours can take up to a week to pour or to fully cure, so you wanna have some patience on this. Which is exactly what we're gonna do now. We are gonna let this set up. I'm gonna babysit this, and then in our next video, we're gonna take a look at what we end up with.